Hi guys, welcome back to another e-learning video. This video will be over how to graph a system of inequalities where you have one linear inequality and one quadratic inequality. So last video I talked about when you had two linear inequalities to make a graph of a system of linear inequalities. I showed you how to do that and showed you where your solutions were. But now we're going to focus on what if one of them is linear and one of them is quadratic. So this you should already know how to do. You graph this like normal, where you start with the y-intercept of 3 and you go up 2 over 3. And this is a dotted line because it's not or equal to, it's just a greater than, so you don't want to count anything that's equal to that line, so you just make it a dotted line when you graph it. And you just shade everything that's greater than this line. So greater than this line means shade up here. So that's all review from last video. But now let's add in a quadratic second inequality instead of a linear inequality for a second one. We're going to have a quadratic one. So here is the quadratic one after you graph it. And a reminder of the way you graph it, you can either factor this using the diamond and rectangle method, or if you can't do it that way, you could use the quadratic formula, and it should tell you what your x-intercepts are, if there are any. And you can also figure out your vertex by doing opposite of b over 2a, and then you could plug in your answer for x, and you could find out what y is. That would tell you exactly what your vertex is. So that would be how you would graph it. But once it is graphed, where are your solutions and how you actually shade? So here you have y is less than this line, or y is equal to this line. So obviously when you graph it, you're okay with it being equal to that line. So when you graph it, you want to make it a solid line so that you know, yes, I am counting that line. I'm counting things that are equal to that line, so it's a solid line. And then you want it to be less than, which means you shade underneath the quadratic. So if this was greater than, we would shade above it, which is actually inside here. And because it's less than, we shade outside. You shade out here underneath this line. So that's just kind of how that works. You have less than, so it's going to go on the outside. If it was greater than here, it would go on the inside here. So underneath here is our shading. And we have a solid line because we do want to count it because it is or equal to. So that is how you graph when you have a linear and a quadratic, but you may need to see another example. So let me try one more example because I think this concept is a little more complicated. So let's do greater than, let's change the numbers here. And we'll stick with the same for that one because we already know about that on how to graph this pretty easily. So here's my new one. I have my new x-intercepts and vertex, and I talked about how you could figure this out. You could factor that, or you could use the quadratic formula and find out what your x-intercepts are. They're -4 and -1, and here's your vertex. You could do opposite of b over 2a, and then take your answer and plug it in for x, and find out what the y part is, and you would have your whole vertex. But once it is graphed, how do you shade it? How do you graph it? So you would take this one that you already have graphed, shaded here in red, but how do you do this one? So it's greater than, which means it's inside. That's what the inside version looks like when it's greater than, or equal to. So I left it solid. But now where are the solutions? Does it work the same way as linear system does? Yes, it works exactly the same way a linear system of inequalities does. You're looking for the double shading. So you shade it above here and you shade it in here. So wherever you see the double shading, which would be all the stuff in here, not this line, but everything above and inside here is your solution. So you could test something out. You could test out like -3, 4, and try it as -3, 4 in here, -3 for x and 4 in here, and make sure it works. And you'll know, that way you'll know if you've graphed everything correctly. But it should be everything in here, not counting this line, but you are counting things on this line. And then obviously these are not solutions because these are not shaded at all. So that is the basics of how you graph a system of inequalities when you have one that's linear, one inequality that's linear, and one that's quadratic.